Hi, hello, and welcome. I am wearing what I call the amazing coat, which was a coat that was made for me by my mother's best friend when I requested it, and she was like, no, that's impossible. And I was like, I think you mean challenge accepted. And she did. It's such a cool coat. I need more reasons to wear it. I figured that it would be the perfect accessory for the review of the next book that we're going to be reviewing, and that is a book that was requested by a patron. So let's get into it. Why am I wearing this coat? Well, it's because of the setting. You see, it has a sort of Victorian setting, and this coat looks like it could be vaguely Victorian, right? The book we are talking about is a Wayfarer, and now let us read the blurb on Goodreads. In this heroic gas lamp fantasy, superhuman abilities bring adventure and a new dimension to 1820 London, where an outlaw speedster and a master of illusion do battle to decide who will own the city. You think being a superhero is hard? Try being the first one. Will's life is a proper muddle, and all because he was accidentally inflicted with the ability to run faster and to leap higher than any human ever. One minute he's a blacksmith apprentice trying to save his master from debtor's prison. The next he's accused of murder and hunted as a black-hearted highwayman. A vengeful politician with dark secrets and powers even more magical than Will's has duped all of London into blaming Will for the chilling imprisonments of the city's poor. The harder Will tries to use his abilities to fight crime, the deeper he's entangled in the dark underworld, belonging to some of Georgian England's most colorful characters. Only Will stands a chance to stop this powerful madman bent on reforming London by any means necessary. Unfortunately, Will is beginning to realize that becoming a legend might mean sacrificing everything that matters. So yes, I guess it's not technically Victorian, it's Georgian, but I don't care, same vibes. Gas lamp, steampunk-ish. It is historical fiction, so I think most of the historical stuff is accurate. It just has the added addition of superheroes. And let me just say, I fully understand if your first instinct when I tell you that this is basically The Flash meets Spider-Man, No Way Home, the one where he fights Mysterio, but set in basically Victorian London. I understand if that makes you want to rush out and buy this book immediately, as well you should, because that premise sounds pretty neat, right? This is the fan fiction you've been waiting for. And yeah, it is kind of fanficky. So now I'm certain you're thinking, well, Julian, you must have loved it because that sounds awesome. You see, I feel bad because my patron loved it and hoped that I would love it. And I didn't. Oops. It has things in it that I should love. Love the setting. I mean, I use a Victorian setting for Adventurer Mage as well, although my setting is more vaguely Victorian than this one. This one is like very, very like historical. I'm not a big fan of superhero things. Like I like superhero movies, but that's about it. I don't read comic books and I don't particularly like superhero books. But I was hopeful with this one because it seemed so intriguing. Unfortunately, this let me down quite a bit. Boy, oh boy. I really struggled. Every time I set this thing down, I really struggled to have the motivation to pick it back up. And I think if I hadn't been reading it for a patron, it probably would have been DNF'd. Not because I was like so filled with rage that I didn't want to pick it back up again, but just because it was kind of zigging everywhere that I wished it would zag, you know? So let's try to go through it and see what I liked and what I especially didn't like about this book, because I could totally see how this would be a hit for somebody else. It just wasn't a hit for me. This is one of those cases where I can be like, yeah, I can see why other people like it, but also I have a very clear idea of why I don't. We're gonna talk about characters, plot, world building, prose, all of that good juicy stuff. And then, like I have been doing at the end of book reviews, we're gonna talk about what we as authors can probably take away from this book. And I will mention good things that we can take away, as well as things that we can take away from where the author is maybe not succeeding. God, I look good in this coat. I need more reason to wear this coat. So, all right, let's talk about the characters. Now, the first character is Will, the main character. And, He's one of the reasons I didn't like this book. I think that it is time for me to come to terms with the fact that I just don't like his type of male hero. I need something more, because he is every male main character that we read, us millennials, that we read growing up. You know, remember when we were kids and like in our tweens and teens, and the badass girl genre hadn't quite hit it off yet, and so we were stuck just reading about guys going on adventures a lot of the time, and it was really always the same guy, just like maybe with different hair. You know how nowadays all the male love interests are just reskinned resands? This guy is just a reskin of all of those white bread, just sort of blandly heroic main characters that we read in our youth. And I just have to come to terms with the fact that I don't like that type of character. It's just not for me. Now, maybe it's for you, maybe that doesn't bother you as much, and that's not a problem. You're not wrong for liking that type of character. I just don't. So Will is that. Will is just good. He's a Gary Stu. He is a Gary Stu. Every problem he runs into, he does, like, it might trip him up for a second, but he pretty much gets out of it. And he is, like it mentions, he's the first superhero. So other than the ultimate bad guy, nobody can truly challenge Will. Because a speedster, with the level of speed that he has in a Victorian setting, he can dodge bullets. So that pretty much is the beginning and end of things that could harm Will, and he can usually get out of the way of those. So even when he's in a dangerous situation, it never felt all that dangerous, because Will was just so much more superior to everyone with his superpower. And of course he is, like I said, he is just good. And, you know, I've gotten sick of that, of just a character who's just good and earnest and just always trying to do the right thing. Golly gosh, gee willikers, I'm just trying to be a good person. It's boring. Like, we always love to find out why the sad, broody one is sad and broody. How come we never have to have an explanation for why this motherfucker is just so inherently good? I want to shake him and be like, I don't know, have a complex thought for once in your life, Will. Try it out. You have superpowers. Maybe you could do some crimes every now and then. Like, he does, but he doesn't really. Like, there's a time where he works for a crime boss, but Will finds a way to work for a crime boss in a way that doesn't actually really hurt good people. He works for a crime boss and still hurts villains. So yeah, he never really has to be bad. Like, most of the time when he's like bad, it's just like his image is being smeared, and he's just such a good guy. And we don't have to explore it because he's that archetype. And I just don't like that archetype. I find it extremely boring. The side characters definitely helped elevate this book a little bit. Not enough for me, not enough to like save it, but the side characters are where it's at. Will is just a bland piece of white bread wandering around the world with superpowers, but the side characters are a little bit more interesting. He of course has a love interest who is also just, you know, she's your standard love interest. She's beautiful, blonde, aristocratic, so you know, because Will is a peasant and she's an aristocrat, so you've got that whole thing, like, she's so high above him. He calls her the golden goddess in his head. I hate that. I hate it. I don't really like their relationship because it's so stereotypical. She's endangered a lot. She gets to have little moments of like girl power, but it's always got to be just like, ooh, I'm so spunky, but in the end my man has to save the day. And I can see right through it. It's just every stereotypical love interest in these things. One of the things that the patron who suggested this book to me mentioned was that they liked how the romance turned out. So I kept waiting for it to throw in some surprising thing, and it never really did. Like, at the very, very end, there is something mildly unexpected, but it wasn't enough. And they're still gonna end up together. It's just this mild, unexpected thing in between. So it's like happily ever after coming soon for them. So no, their romance was nothing special, and she was also cardboard in my opinion. But then there are characters like this little girl that he runs into, who, of course I've forgotten her name because I'm so terrible with names of characters in books. And also this book kind of left a negative impression on me. Like, it's kind of leaving my brain very swiftly, and I probably should have filmed this review sooner because I've already lost a lot of details from this book. but that's because there's a lot of books, so we'll talk about that a little bit later. But there's a little girl that he befriends who she's just kind of becomes his adopted daughter, and he's a little bit unwilling to let that happen, but she is actually an interesting character. Yes, she's the spunky kid archetype, but at least as the spunky kid archetype, she's a useful spunky kid archetype. She's also the archetype of the sidekick, because this book is very, very standard superhero story 101. But she's the sidekick, and she's probably the most interesting character. The other character I liked was one of the villains, Mr. Monarch. He was interesting. I really wish that he had gotten more depth. Like, there was plenty of opportunity for him to have more depth. But in the end, all of the villains were finger-tenting, mwahaha. But I still liked Mr. Monarch. Like, I liked him for his potential more than what we actually got. But at least there was that. And then there were some other side characters who kind of all blend together. He's got a couple of guys. When Will is being a criminal, he makes friends with a couple of other criminals, and I get them mixed up, and he makes friends with a cop, and they're all just kind of guy-shaped in my head, but none of them really made an impression on me. They're just like faces in a crowd. It doesn't help that everybody in this book is just so similar to each other. Physically, like in their descriptions, like all the girls are blonde, and all the guys are just like the same man. Except Mr. Monarch I think Mr. Monarch is supposed to be fat, because fat equals evil, but I did not picture him that way. I pictured him kind of like skinny and hunched over, and sometimes you just picture a character how you picture a character. Anyway, so the characters were mostly misses for me, with a couple of exceptions, and especially Will was a big miss for me, which was a major factor in why I didn't enjoy this book. I just didn't enjoy following him. So now let's talk about plot, and that was the other major miss for me in this book, and that is that this book was so safe. It did not take a single risk. There was not a single thing in this book that happened that I could not predict. Now, for me, that's a bug. For you, that might be a feature. If I'm going to read a superhero story, I want something done with it besides just the setting is different. The only thing that this book did that was not just the most bog standard superhero story you've ever read was the setting, the gas lamp fantasy setting. Otherwise, it never did anything unexpected, and it felt very derivative. When I say it was like The Flash meets Spider-Man, No Way Home, whichever one he fought Mysterio in, I mean it. It's that. He has the powers of the Flash, the personality of Spider-Man, in my opinion, but not as quippy. He's not very quippy. He's just kind of a brick. It's just a handsome brick running around the city. And then he fights Mysterio. And that entire same plot happens. I mean, it's in the blurb. The bad guy uses illusions to make it look like Will is the bad guy. And that happens like 3 times. This also, a big problem that I had with this book is that it was repetitive and it was too long. Like the pacing, there was a lot of action scenes. I had heard that the pacing was a bit slow, so I expected there to not be as much action as there is, because that's usually what people mean when they mean the pacing is slow, is there's not enough action. But there are a lot of action scenes. Will spends a lot of his time running around London doing things TM. Often the same things over and over again. He recycles some plot lines, just like escalating the same plot line over and over again. I'll get to this when I get to prose, but I can mention it now. The action scenes were well written. I would look at this as a good opportunity to see how to write good action scenes. Cool. But after a while, you kind of realize that they're all the same, and the plot just kept going, and there were like 13 false climaxes, in my opinion. I kept thinking the book was almost over. There'd be an action scene that felt pretty climactic, and I'm like, okay, this is it. We're getting there. Book's almost over. And then I'd look at my phone because I was listening to it, and it'd be like hours left, and I'm like, what? How? It just kept going and going and going, and there's so many scenes that I would have just cut out and made this book a lot more streamlined and a lot less repetitive. Now, like I said, some people are gonna love it. Some people are just gonna be like in for just watching Will run around the city being a superhero. I got bored and I started to like skim. Can you skim when you're listening? I did speed it up significantly after a certain point because I was just ready to be done. I was like, I get the point. I get it. The other thing that's weird, and I'm going to put this in plot, There's this whole emphasis that Will has on the plague. The plague, the plague, the plague. He never had the plague. Oh, it's the plague. They call the thing that happened to him where he got the superpowers, they call it the plague. And I don't know what's going on with that. Like, it seems like it's a really important plot point, but then it's not really. Like, can it be a plague if only 2 people ended up with superpowers? So we start out the entire book with Will walking across a field to talk to the mad scientist who eventually gives him his powers. And one of the first things that Will thinks about is like, thank goodness I never caught the plague. And we're like, oh, okay, that's gotta be important. What's the plague? We never really find out. It seems to be the sickness that may or may not have happened, that may or may not have made Will susceptible to getting superpowers when he comes in contact with this like magic superpower ooze. You know, there's always got to be something. He was, you know, he's bitten by a radioactive spider, whatever. Whatever the thing was that gave him his power from the mad scientist, he might have been more susceptible to it because of the plague that he may or may not have had as a child. But it is, to me, it was super confusing. Maybe there was so much book here, maybe it was explained at some point, but it felt like it was going to be so important since that was what the main character was thinking about very first thing when he's walking across this field. And it was just like this confusing little side plot where every now and then people will be like, oh, you had the plague, and Will would be like, I did not have the plague. I'll have you know that I will never be mistaken for someone who had the plague. And it's just confusing. I was also disappointed because near the beginning of the book, we discover a teleporting ferret. Actually, I think it might be an invisible ferret, but like he looks at it and then it pops out of existence. And I like to think it teleported away, but it might have just become invisible. And it like comes up maybe one other time in the book, and I'm really disappointed because I wanted the teleporting ferret as an animal companion so bad. Plot-wise, disappointing, repetitive. Like, Will goes into the city, he hobnobs with rich people for a while, he hobnobs with criminals and poor people for a while, and then he just does that a bunch of times. And he runs a lot, very fast, up walls. And you might be like, well, does he have any weaknesses? And yes and no. The 2 weaknesses that he gets is, 1, he becomes very sensitive to light, which exists only so that he has to wear sunglasses so that that adds to his like superhero uniform, because the author like really wants to get him in a certain outfit. So the sunglasses are just for that. But also, he gets like dizzy spells and he gets like vertigo when he like climbs up things, so he can run up a wall, but then he'll get super dizzy when he's up there. And you're like, okay, well that's a pretty good like thing to give him as like a weakness, except for it's not really a weakness, because we find out that when he's like having these dizzy spells, he can see through the illusions that the bad guy casts. So his weaknesses are, 1, to give him cool guy sunglasses, and 2, actually not a weakness, it's just part of his superpower, it's just kind of an inconvenient part of his superpower. And then later his girlfriend just like gives him a potion that cures it, kind of. Will never really has too many challenges in his life. Like, things happen to him, certainly, and he gets into scrapes. But like I said, he's a bit of a Gary Stu, and you're never really worried. He's a speedster in Victorian London. Nobody else can match him. He can get out of every situation. So that's a problem with having him be like one of the only superheroes. I thought that maybe there would be other people, because it says like he's the first, but I thought that he would maybe get in touch with other people who also got superpowers besides the villain. But no, he's the first and only besides the villain. One other thing I wanted to talk about with plot that made me go, huh? Is it only came up once that I noticed. I was kind of skimming this book as we got into like the final like 4th or something. But there was one thing that I noticed where he was at this party where the bad guy was pulling the plot from The Great Mouse Detective, where he had like a fake king that he was like puppeteering. It wasn't a robot, it was an illusion, but same vibes.
Noble stature, I present to you a statesman among mice.
And Will was at this party and the bad guy was doing that, and the bad guy was like talking about his plan to eliminate like classism. He's like, we have too many poor, we need to deal with this, we need to like get everybody on the same playing field, which to the people in the crowd sounded like he was saying, we need to help the poor, we need to elevate the poor, we need to like make them not poor anymore, we need to get rid of classes. But of course we know that he's the bad guy, so what he actually means is kill the poor. But the rest of the crowd doesn't know that, and Will doesn't know that. And so he's listening to this speech, and he hears like this guy being like, I want to eliminate the class system. And Will thinks, oh, but if we get rid of the class system, how will us poor have anything to strive for? And I was like, excuse me? I didn't think that this was a viewpoint that Will necessarily had. It just came out of nowhere, and it was so odd. It was that whole idea that the poor need to stay poor so that they can learn to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. It's good that they're starving, actually, because that's going to teach them to be tougher, you know, like the rich. Famous for their toughness. Oh, it was so hard being born with generational wealth. Whew, really had to pull myself up by my bootstraps there, friends, let me tell ya. But anyway, that sentiment was gone about as quickly as it appeared, and I think it basically just existed so that Will would have some reason to disagree with the bad guy, even though to the public it seemed like he was saying like a good thing, like, hey, let's get rid of the class system. And then of course later we found out that he meant we should kill all of the poor. So then Will could oppose him without needing to have questionable viewpoints. So now that we've talked about the plot and the problems that I have with the plot, let's talk about the world building. Like I said, it was very, very historical setting, and it was cool, I guess. A little bit, like some people have complained in their critiques of it that the author was really, really interested that you knew that she knew a lot about the setting. So yeah, there are definitely times where you're just gonna be reading about stuff in London. And if that interests you, I mean, it kind of interested me. I didn't actually mind that stuff all that much. As a result of the setting, everything is kind of bland, and it makes the characters kind of bland, and nothing is really challenged. Like I said, the bad guys are bad. There really aren't very many women characters, and other than the little girl, the women characters are very, very stereotypical, as well as the guy characters. You've got the hot love interest who is an upper class lady, a hooker who has almost certainly got consumption and is going to die. And everybody kind of looks down on her. They either pity her or look down on her. Oh, and the bad guy's wife, whose main job is to be just unreasonably dedicated to him, and like his perfect spouse who lives for love, because women just want to be loved. That's what they want more than anything else in the entire world. It doesn't matter how intelligent or educated they are. They really just, all they want is their husbands to love them. So it was just, I didn't like the way that women were treated in this book. The little girl, because she's the sidekick archetype, got to do a little bit more, but even she spent a lot of her time needing to be rescued and being pathetic a lot, but she's a child, so it's like, and that makes sense. And people would say, well, that's realistic, and it's like, yeah, but also this guy's running around with super speed powers, and there's a teleporting ferret. Ah, the train is here. Hello, train. So could we have the just mildest of quote-unquote unrealistic things and have interesting women? The train is like, no, shut up. We don't want any of that in our Victorian story. Get out of here. But yeah, it was very bland in that way too, because of the world building. There was just no risks taken. And that's my biggest problem with this book. There were no risks taken. This book was so safe in every way. It never did anything surprising. And looking at this author's like catalog of books, she has written a lot of books that are how to write books. So it makes sense to me that her book would be very by the numbers. Somebody who I think got their start, I think she wrote her nonfiction before she wrote her fiction. I could be wrong, but I was just kind of looking at her Goodreads, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed like she wrote more of her nonfiction before she wrote her fiction, and it does not surprise me that somebody who like writes a lot of books telling other authors how to write plays it very safe. Follows the beats, except for she just kept recycling the beats in this book over and over again. But she did not stray from the path. She did not do anything unusual or unexpected or challenging. And maybe you're in the mood for that. That's why I want to say, like, this might be the book for you, because maybe you're in the mood for that. Maybe that's a feature, not a bug. Maybe you want something that's just very comforting because it will not challenge you. You don't have to think when you read this book. It's vibes. You're just there for the vibes. You're there for the superhero. You just want to read the same superhero story again, but with a slightly different setting. Because sometimes we want that. Sometimes we want that safety, that feeling of coziness, of reading something we've read 1,000 times, but maybe with just a slightly different setting. I mean, no offense to romance book writers, but that's what romance books basically are. And I've written a romance book, so I know. So this could be the book for you if you just want something that feels very safe and very predictable and very not challenging. And the last thing I want to say about this book, and I'm just kind of saving the best for last here, is get the audiobook version. Holy crap, the audiobook version. That's one of the reasons I picked this one up, because the patron gave me a bunch of different options, like here are some books that you could choose from to read for me, because they're on the Boss Me Around tier of Patreon, and they said that this one had a full cast audio with sound effects, music written specifically for it, and I was like, that sounds great. And it was so good, like immaculate. 1,000 out of 10 for the audiobook. I wish, like, this is the dream. This author is actually an indie author, and I wish that I had the money and the infrastructure to do this with my books, because it was awesome. So good. You'd think that the sound effects and stuff would be distracting, but for me they weren't. The music did get a little distracting in a couple of places where I would have like tapered off the music, but like the voices and the voice work were so good. The quality was amazing. The actors were amazing. So like, listen to the audiobook of this. I'm not kidding. If you're gonna consume this book, I cannot recommend enough that you listen to the audiobook. Really wish that I had enjoyed this book and it just wasn't for me, but maybe it's for you. And that's the great thing about reviews, is like the very things that I didn't like might entice you to go read this book. So if it interests you, definitely go check it out. But do get the audiobook if you at all can listen to audiobooks. Oh, and the last thing I wanted to cover is what can we learn from this book, what it did well and what it did poorly. And like I mentioned before, I would definitely look at this book for action scenes. The action scenes were well described. I could follow them easily. They were very well done. There's just a lot of them and they were repetitive, but definitely look at this book for action scenes. Things that were done poorly, again, I would say that this book needed to be cut down significantly. Scenes needed to be combined. Scenes needed to be cut completely. And this book just needed to be tightened up. Like a corset being tightened. This book needed to be tightened. So what we can learn from this is like, yeah, you've got a lot of cool scenes in your book, but I think it's really important to think about ways that you could potentially eliminate them if they're not doing anything, and or combine them so that you can get your point across without having quite such a long book, especially if a lot of your scenes are very repetitive. Oh, and I guess I didn't talk about the prose either. Oh my goodness, I'm like so behind today. Prose, really quickly, it took a while to get into because this author was using a stylized type of prose, trying to fit the tone of the setting. So they used a lot of like slang from that time period, and the rhythm of the words and everything was like a lot more from that time period, and so it took a while to get into. Did make me cringe a little bit. It was a little bit cringy in my opinion. I wish that the author had written it just in a more straightforward, standard way, but if you like it, you'll really like it, I think. And if you don't, you might find it kind of frustrating and annoying. So that's my thoughts on prose, is they were being very stylish, and it's going to be a hit or a miss for people as far as that goes. I think I've covered everything. Gosh, I hope so. Don't forget that you can support me on Patreon, where you can boss me around. As we mentioned, this patron bossed me around and made me read this book, because at a certain level, you can do that. Plus, you get other rewards and videos not seen here on the regular channel. Also, don't forget that I'm a developmental editor. You can hire me. Your first 5K words are only $25 to try me out and see if we are a good fit, because not every developmental editor is going to be a good fit for everyone. But I am going to let you all go now, and I will see you again next time with whatever it is I happen to be doing next time. Bye!
Have fun storming the castle.
Think it'll work?
It would take a miracle. Bye-bye.
My patrons and I always have fun storming the castle. Patrons like Sarah, Lisa, Amanda, Jenny, Savvy, Scribbling Cat, Rennie, Jesper, Zaire, Shelby, Ray, Callison, Anne Sophie, Patrick, Belle, White Julie, Hidden Glade, Kit, Merween, Sophia, Ashley, Swamp Goblin Waifu, Melissa, Afra, Deborah, Rita, Alyssa, Celia, Amanda, Lafone, KJ, Jessica, Caitlin, Ursula, Robin, Jojo Bookish, Bear, Kirsten, Justin, Maria Mooney, Kohikaro, Kira, Sam, Haley, Julius the Nice Dragon, Pansing Pony, Roma, Veda, 78 Kilograms of Shade, Kat, Sarah M, Nico, Sunny Shy, Bird Anonymous, July, Martha Baggins, SB Boots, and Ruin, Queen of Oblivion.